To the ordinary man of science, water is a mineral and ice a rock. But to the glacialist, both are fluids. The apparent solidity of ice is an illusion due to the dullness of our senses. The reason why its viscous or semi-fluid character remained unsuspected until a comparatively recent period is due to the fact that the ordinary movement of accessible glaciers was so slow that we could not by observation readily note their rate of progress. The difference between water and other substances is most noticeable in the phenomena connected with solidification and fusing. Lead melts at 612 degrees Fahrenheit, above zero. Sulfur at 226 degrees. Water at 32 degrees, while mercury becomes liquid at 39 degrees below zero. And some other substances at even lower temperatures. Thus, with reference to its fusing point, water appears toward the middle of the scale. If, like the fabled salamander, man were able to endure intense degrees of heat, he might very likely sustain relations to iron similar to those he now sustains to water. He might then bathe with pleasure in a molten flood and venture on the thin crust of a glowing mass of metal. The suddenness with which water passes from the solid to the liquid state, and the amount of heat absorbed in the process of fusion involved many important consequences. Down to the freezing point, water may be made to part with its heat by gradual stages. But in the act of freezing, it suddenly gives out an enormous amount of heat. On the contrary, when ice melts, a corresponding amount of heat is absorbed in accomplishing the result. To melt a cubic foot of ice requires as much heat as to raise a cubic foot of water, 80 degrees Celsius or 144 degrees Fahrenheit. For our knowledge of the nature of the movements taking place in glaciers, we are largely indebted to the investigations of Louis Agassiz and Professor Forbes between the years 1840 and 1842, and later to more detailed investigations of Professor Tyndall and other physicists. The mode of measurement with all these investigators was essentially the same. Stakes were driven across a glacier in a line at right angles to the direction of the movement, and by means of a theodolite, accurate notations were taken from hour to hour and day to day of any changes in the relative position of the points where the stakes were driven. The uniform result of these observations was that the line of stakes began immediately to curve slowly down near the middle, showing that the motion on the surface was greater near the middle than on the sides. This curve continued to increase as long as the stakes remained standing. Professor Tyndall's observations show also that the most rapid line of motion on the surface of a glacier is not exactly in the middle, but that wherever there is a bend in the glacial current, the more rapid movement is uniformly on the convex side of the channel, so that the curve of the line of most rapid motion is more tortuous than that of the main channel. This conforms to the facts concerning the movement of water in a crooked riverbed, and illustrates again the analogy between the movement of ice and that of water. The most rapid motion observed by Tyndall in the summertime in the center of one of the largest of the alpine glaciers was 37 inches per day. Near the sides of the glacier, however, the movement was reduced to 2 or 3 inches. The rate of motion during the winter was only about 1/2 that of the summer. A further resemblance of the motion of a glacier to that of a river appears in the fact that the ice near the top moves faster than that near the bottom. At a point in the Mer de Glace, where the side of the glacier is exposed, presenting a wall of ice about 150 feet in height, Professor Tyndall drove 3 stakes, one at the summit of the ice, another 35 feet from the bottom, and another 4 feet from the bottom. Upon examination of them at the end of 24 hours, it appeared that, while the top stake had moved forward 6 inches, the middle one had moved but 4.5 inches, and the bottom stake but 2 2/3 of an inch. In all these experiments, the influence of friction is clearly visible. The ice of the glacier is retarded by the friction of the sides and bottom of the channel through which it moves, so that the most rapid motion is upon the surface, near the middle, the part farthest removed from this retarding influence. A little attention to this last principle will prepare the mind for crediting the observations which more recently have been reported from the large glaciers in Greenland and Alaska, showing a motion 15 or 20 times that of the alpine glaciers. As the cross-section of a glacier is increased, the relative influence of friction in retarding the motion is rapidly diminished. The friction on the sides of a glacier 2 miles wide is no greater than that upon 1/4 of a mile in width, though the cross-section is 8 times as large. A cross-section of the Mer de Glace at Le Moulin is estimated to be 190,000 square yards, whereas a cross-section of the Muir Glacier in Alaska, a mile above its mouth, is upwards of 1 million square yards. Though observation shows that ice actually moves as if it were a fluid, the scientific imagination is tasked to the utmost to conceive how much motion can be consistent with other manifest qualities of the material. For in many conditions, ice seems as brittle as glass and as inelastic as granite. The mystery is probably solved, so far as questions are ever solved, by attention to the facts already referred to concerning the behavior of ice at its melting point. When ice passes into water, an immense amount of heat is absorbed in the process, which yet does not produce any effect upon the thermometer. If a hole be bored in the surface of a melting glacier, and a thermometer inserted, it will stand at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If the same thermometer be inserted in the subglacial stream issuing from the ice front, it will stand at the same point. Yet the absolute difference between the heat contained in the particles of ice and that contained in the particles of water is 144 degrees Fahrenheit. So much heat being occupied in keeping the substance in a liquid form. Ice is also transparent to the rays of heat, as it is to the rays of light. Scoresby amused himself in the Arctic latitudes by making lenses of ice with which to concentrate the sun's rays and set combustible substances on fire. The fusing point of ice is also modified by pressure. Under pressure, the freezing point of water may be lowered 2 or 3 degrees, but upon the removal of the pressure, the water will instantly become solid. This has been demonstrated in various ways. Monsieur Boussingault, for example, filled a hollow steel cylinder with water, having a bullet loose within it, and plugged the aperture up. He then subjected the cylinder to intense cold till the hole was 2 or 3 degrees below the freezing point of water. But that the water remained liquid was evident from the fact that, upon shaking the cylinder, the bullet inside rattled about as at higher temperatures, while upon removing the plug so as to relieve the pressure, the hole was instantly converted into solid ice. Various similar experiments have been made in which, upon removal of the plug, the water ejected from the aperture by the expansive power of the cooling water within the cylinder immediately freezes. The water ejected from the aperture by the expansive power of the cooling water within the cylinder immediately freezes and forms a projecting column of ice several inches in length. It was at first thought that this projecting column illustrated the plasticity of ice, but it is now pretty certain that it illustrates, rather, the curious effect of pressure upon the freezing point of water. The capacity of water at the freezing point to transform itself under varying degrees of pressure from the solid to the liquid state and vice versa is illustrated by another experiment ascribed by Professor Tyndall to Mr. Bottomley. A copper wire was looped over a bar of ice about 4 inches square, and a weight of 12 or 13 pounds was suspended from it. The pressure under the wire caused the ice in immediate contact with it to melt, but as the resulting water escaped around the wire and was relieved from pressure, it immediately froze and cemented together again the walls of ice above the wire. In half an hour, the wire had but cut completely through the bar of ice, and yet the whole breach above it was repaired, and the bar was intact. This capacity of fragments of ice when near the melting point to freeze together when their faces are joined can be readily observed in a variety of experiments. When 2 pieces of ice in a basin of warm water are brought together, they will immediately adhere. If a cake of ice whose temperature is near the melting point be placed in a mold and subjected to pressure, the first result is to break it into pieces. But on continuing the pressure, the particles reunite and freeze together into a shape corresponding to that of the mold. This capacity of ice when near the melting point to undergo disintegration and then to become suddenly recongealed is probably that by which it stimulates in its motion the properties of ordinary fluids, while at the same time retaining other properties connecting it with the most brittle of substances. It is thought by Mr. Kroll and others that when heat passes through a stratum of ice, as it is known to do, it involves a process of transference from one particle of ice to another, in which there are successive melting and freezing of the particles in the progress of the heat, and that finally the molecule of ice upon the opposite side is becoming recongealed. In becoming recongealed, delivers up the unit of heat which had entered the stratum from the other side. But whatever be the explanation of the process, the facts remain that ice behaves in many respects like a fluid, and on application of pressure slowly adjusts itself to its bed or mold in obedience to the force applied. And, if time enough is given, moves wherever a fluid would find its way. Ice is plastic under pressure and brittle under tension. Snow is one form of ice, and as every schoolboy who makes a snowball knows, can by a moderate degree of pressure be made into compact ice. The reason why snow is white and ice is blue is that snow is pulverized, while in ice the particles are brought into closer contact, and the enclosed air is expelled, so that the real color of the substance is brought out. The powder of almost any substance differs in color from the compact mass. Glacial ice is compressed snow, and originates wherever the snowfall is largely in excess of the melting power of the sun and warm currents of air. Anyone can observe how much more compact old snow is than new, and how under pressure the lower strata in a snowbank become in a single season almost like ice. Hence, it is easy to see what must be the result where the annual snowfall is never wholly melted away. In such regions, the ice would accumulate without limit, were it not for its semi-fluid character, which permits it to flow off in lines of least resistance to lower levels and toward warmer climes. In structure, glacial ice is characterized by both veins and fissures, two phenomena which are produced by opposite causes, the first by pressure and the second by tension. Glacial ice ordinarily presents a veined structure. Instead of being homogeneous, it consists of alternate bands of light-colored and blue ice. These bands do not, however, lie in a horizontal position, but are often vertical. Sometimes they run parallel with the movement of the glacier, and sometimes at right angles to the motion, while at other times they are arranged at an angle of 45 degrees, pointing down the line of motion. From close examination, it appears that the veins are always at right angles to the line of greatest pressure. For example, where two branches of a glacier join and press together from the sides, longitudinal veins are produced below the point of junction. And again, where the ice has descended a declivity and is advancing upon a less inclined plane, the increased pressure necessary to push the mass along produces bands at right angles to the line of motion, thus demonstrating the connection of veins with pressure. The theory is that the blue veins in the ice are those from which pressure has expelled the particles of air, thus making it more compact and giving it its blue color. As already remarked, snow is white because of the abundant particles of air enclosed within it. Under pressure, it can be transformed into blue ice, corresponding to the blue veins alluded to. An active glacier is also characterized by fissures. Whenever the ice stream reaches a point where its slope is increased, even by a very small amount, a change in inclination of 2 degrees being sufficient, the ice, instead of moving in a continuous stream, forms crevasses across the current, which gradually enlarge at the top until they present a series of long chasms, very difficult for the explorer to traverse. Where there is considerable irregularity in the bottom and the increased slope extends for some distance, these crevasses become very complicated, and the surface presents an expanse of towers and domes and pinnacles of ice, often of fantastic appearance. But at the bottom, these masses are still joined, and on coming down to a gentler slope, they close up again at the surface for their onward march.